Hi, I'm Drew Geyer, and this is my tent talk on workshopping. Um, I think that workshopping is a technique that most folks associate with creative writing courses, and I do teach creative writing at this university. But I also teach the senior seminar course, and I use workshopping to help those senior writers grapple with this 20-page paper they have to write with at least 8 sources and covering 2 books. So this workshopping technique can be used for creative assignments, for academic assignments, for just about anything, as long as you can craft the assignment and use the workshops correctly. The objectives for this assignment are, first and foremost, to help students learn the writing process. In other words, to help them be deliberate in their approach to creating an end product. Second, to help students write in greater detail and with better focus. And finally, to help students become better critical readers. All 3 of these elements are involved in scaffolded workshopping, which is what we're going to talk about today. Now, when we talk about workshopping, we're really talking about 2 different things, and both of them can be used in combination, or you can use one or the other, right? The first is a small group approach. This activity involves splitting the class into clusters of between 2 and 4 students and having those students read and discuss each other's writing only. In other words, the only folks whose writing each group is seeing are the other people in the group. That's different from the whole class approach. With a whole class approach, every person in the class reads, listens to, and comments on the writing of every other person in the class. Oftentimes what I will do, and that's what we're going to do in this particular assignment that we're about to cover, is start with small group activity and then segue into whole class work as we move toward a final draft. So whether you're planning to workshop in small groups, whole class groups, or a mix of the 2, which I highly recommend, especially for lower division writers, you have to craft your writing assignment to fit your strategy with the class. For me, scaffolded assignments are really the only way to go with workshopping. You don't want students turning in a final draft and then workshopping it. What's the point? I recommend an initial small group workshop followed by a whole class workshop, or even 2, which is the case with the assignment that I'm going to share with you guys in the next slide. Preferably an assignment that makes the students brainstorm, put together a partial draft, expand that partial draft into a full initial draft, and then revise that initial draft into a final copy is the way to work if you have time enough in the course, right? But if you structure the assignment correctly, you can really knock out that entire assignment sequence in just a matter of weeks. So the assignment that I'm sharing with you for this tent talk is for a 3 to 5 page short story. And the assignment is designed for the student to move from brainstorming through to free writing, through to the purposeful organization of details into an opening scene. If you'll look at section 1, it's a series of questions designed to sort of show each of these students, even though they're 18, 19, 20 years old, that they've lived fiction-worthy life experiences that they can mine to make stories out of. The second section is the free writing activity that's designed to get them to focus on details. And the third section is the focused sort of like arranging those details into a structure that is actually the first scene of a fictional narrative. And the workshopping strategy for this assignment is to small group that opening scene, have the students expand it into an initial draft or rough draft, which will be workshopped with a whole class, and then to revise based on that workshopping experience to a final copy that will be read aloud to the class. And that's sort of like the gold standard test, as we'll talk about soon. So this part of the process is the part that you have to manage carefully as the instructor. When you put students in a small group and you have them share copies with each other of their answers to the questions, their free written details, and their shaped scene, it's very, very unwise, in my opinion, for them to try and focus on sentence and paragraph level problems, right? For me, the focus of the kids in these small groups should be on content, right? Major things like, is the setting clear? Are the characters clearly drawn? Is the point of view consistent? And then to make suggestions to each of the people whose pieces they read about where they might go content-wise with the rest of the story. Once you've got those initial drafts and you move on to the whole class setting, I recommend having them first read each other's work, right? And comment on those readings, right? What I do in those whole class sessions is use a technique called the bell of silence, which is something that I learned when I was in graduate school. At the beginning of each student's workshop moment where their draft is being talked about, the bell of silence comes to hover over the head of the student whose work is being looked at and talked about. That student cannot talk. That student must remain silent while the class talks about the work. Once the class is done talking about the work, and oftentimes you're going to have to lead that discussion, right? You'll have read that draft coming in, and maybe you want to make sure that the class talks about 2 or 3 or 4 things that you think need to be talked about, right? If they don't get to that place themselves, then you can guide them there by asking pointed questions. Once the class is done with their discussion, the bell of silence goes poof, and the student whose work is being talked about has a chance to answer questions, ask questions of the class that maybe they had questions about their work that the class hasn't answered, right? And then you, as the instructor, get the last word for the whole workshop experience, and then you move on to the next student. Usually in a 75-minute class, you can do 3 to 5 of these sessions per. So if you've got a 15-person class, you're looking at 3 class sessions for this particular workshop assignment, right? So this part of the process is really the payoff. I always have students read their drafts aloud, their final drafts aloud in class. The reason for that's simple. It's almost impossible for them to, while they're reading a story that they wrote aloud in front of other folks, to sort of skim through the ungood parts and pretend like they're not there, especially when they compose on screen and they revise on screen. Boy, it's easy to sort of like focus on the good parts and go real quickly through the bad parts, right? When they're performing, though, that's impossible. So one of the best ways that I see my own writing is when I read aloud in front of an audience, right? It really gives me a window into a piece that I don't get any other way, right? That experience of seeing and hearing the audience react or not react when they're supposed to is instructive, and it's a good lesson for the kids, right? Once they're done reading their drafts, you follow that same bell of silence workshop technique as before, right? The student has the bell hover over her or his head while the class discusses what's been read to them. One of the things I do as the leader of that discussion is make sure to focus on changes that have been made over time to that particular piece of writing. I'll ask the students who were in that small group who looked at the initial draft and say, hey guys, what do you see that's changed from that first bit through the part that we read in class last time to the part that got read today, right? What changes have you seen? What positive changes, right? What do you think still needs to change going forward, right? Once you've managed a couple of these and the class gets the idea of what they're supposed to do, you don't have to manage nearly as much. They get it. These kids are smart and they can learn. It's just a matter of helping them learn. I think they're very interested in being good writers, but they're intimidated by writing. And our jobs as writing teachers are to give them the tools that they need to make themselves better writers outside of the class.